Vincent Marchetti grabbed the waitress by the wrist before she could pull away, and the entire diner went silent. "Where did you get this?" he said, his voice shaking in a way none of his men had ever heard before. His finger pointed at the thin gold chain around her neck, at the small sapphire pendant hanging from it, catching the light of the diner's cheap ceiling lamps. The waitress, a young woman named Elena Whitfield, froze in place. Her tray tilted, and the coffee cup on it rattled against the metal edge. She looked down at his hand around her wrist, then up at his face, and what she saw there frightened her more than his grip did. This was not anger. This was something closer to grief tearing itself open after years of being sealed shut. "Sir, please," she said quietly, "you're hurting me." Vincent let go at once, as if her words had burned him. He sat back in the booth, his broad shoulders sinking, his eyes still locked on the necklace. Around him, the other men at his table exchanged glances. Daniel, his driver and closest guard, half rose from his seat, unsure whether to protect his boss or simply disappear into the wall. No one in this city had ever seen Vincent Marchetti lose control in public. Not once. Not in 15 years. "That necklace," Vincent said again, softer now, though his eyes had gone glassy. "Where did it come from?" Elena took a step back, her hand instinctively rising to touch the pendant at her throat, as though checking that it was still there, still hers. "It was my mother's," she said. "She gave it to me before she passed. Why does it matter to you?" Vincent did not answer right away. He stared at the small blue stone, turning it over in his memory, seeing another version of it resting against another woman's collarbone, 5 years earlier, on the last night he had ever seen her alive. His wife, Isabella, had worn that exact necklace the evening before she died. He had chosen it for her himself, on their 10th anniversary, from a small jeweler in the old part of the city, who no longer existed. There was only one necklace like it in the world. He had made certain of that. "That necklace was buried with my wife," he finally said. "I put it around her neck myself before they closed the casket." The words landed on the table like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel's jaw tightened. The other men at the table looked at each other, unsure what to do with information that made no sense. If the necklace had been buried 5 years ago, how could it be sitting here now, in a run-down diner, around the neck of a woman who could not have been older than 23? Elena's face had gone pale. She glanced toward the kitchen door, as if hoping someone would come out and rescue her from this conversation, but no one did. The diner, usually filled with the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation, had gone almost completely quiet. A few other customers were watching now, sensing that something important was happening, though none of them understood what. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, though her voice wavered. "My mother gave this to me 2 years ago, right before she died. She told me never to sell it, no matter how bad things got. She said it was the only thing of real value we had left." Vincent studied her face carefully. He had spent his entire life reading people, learning to separate truth from performance, and every instinct in him said this young woman was not lying. Her fear was real, her confusion was real. Whatever secret this necklace carried, she did not know it either. "What was your mother's name?" he asked. "Maria," Elena said. "Maria Whitfield." The name meant nothing to Vincent, and that unsettled him even more. If this woman's mother had somehow acquired his late wife's necklace, there should be some connection between their two worlds, some thread linking them together. But he had never heard the name Maria Whitfield in his life. "What did your mother do for a living?" he asked. Elena hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with how personal the questions had become, but something about the desperate honesty in Vincent's eyes made her answer anyway. She was a caregiver. She worked for wealthy families, taking care of people who were sick, mostly. She never talked much about the families she worked for. She said it wasn't her place to share their business. Vincent's hand tightened around the edge of the table. A caregiver, someone who worked in private homes, tending to people who were unwell. His wife had been unwell in her final months, though at the time he had believed it was simply exhaustion, or perhaps the early stages of an illness the doctors were still trying to identify. He had trusted his household staff to manage her care while he handled the endless demands of his business. He had trusted them completely. "How long ago did your mother pass?" he asked. 2 years ago, Elena said. "She got sick very suddenly. The doctors said it was her heart, but she was young. It didn't make sense to me at the time, and honestly, it still doesn't. Something cold moved through Vincent's chest at those words. A woman who had once cared for the sick, who died suddenly and unexpectedly of heart failure while still young, who had been in possession of a necklace that should have been buried 5 years earlier. None of this could be coincidence. Vincent had lived long enough, and seen enough, to know that when too many strange details lined up in a row, there was almost always a hand arranging them. "I need you to sit down for a moment," Vincent said, gesturing to the empty side of the booth. "Please, I'm not going to hurt you. I only want to understand something, and I think you might be the only person who can help me." Elena glanced nervously at the men surrounding the table, all of them silent, all of them watching her with an intensity she did not understand. She had heard of Vincent Marchetti before, of course. Everyone in the city had. His name was spoken in careful whispers, always accompanied by a mixture of respect and unease. She had never expected to serve him coffee on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and she certainly had never expected him to recognize the one piece of jewelry she owned. "I have other tables," she said weakly, though it was clear she was searching for an excuse to leave rather than stating an actual obstacle. "I'll make sure it's worth your time," Vincent said, and though his tone remained gentle, there was an unmistakable weight behind the words, a promise that carried the authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. Slowly, Elena slid into the booth across from him, keeping as much distance as the small space allowed. Her hands folded in her lap, and she watched him carefully, the way a person watches a large dog they are not certain is friendly. "Tell me about your mother," Vincent said. "Everything you remember. Where she worked, who she worked for, anything she might have said about the families she cared for." Elena took a breath, steadying herself. She didn't talk about her work much. She always said the families valued their privacy, and it wasn't right to gossip about people who trusted her in their homes. But in her last few months, she seemed different, distracted. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at nothing, like she was somewhere else in her mind. "Did she ever mention feeling afraid?" Vincent asked. Elena frowned, thinking back. "Once. She said something strange to me, maybe a week before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should keep the necklace safe and never let anyone know I had it. I thought she just meant it was valuable, and she didn't want it stolen. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was 17. I didn't understand what she meant." Vincent's throat tightened. His wife's necklace, hidden and protected out of fear, passed down with a warning rather than simple affection. This was not the story of a treasured family heirloom. This was the story of evidence, hidden by someone who understood, even if only partially, that it was dangerous to be seen holding it. "Did your mother ever mention working for a family named Marchetti?" he asked. Elena's eyes widened slightly at the name, though not with recognition, only with the growing realization of exactly whose company she was sitting in. "No," she said. "She never said that name." "I would have remembered." Vincent leaned back, running a hand over his face. 5 years of grief, 5 years of believing his wife's death had been nothing more than a cruel accident of health, an illness that no doctor could properly explain in time to save her. 5 years of visiting her grave every month, of speaking to a headstone as though it could hear him, of carrying a guilt he could never quite name because he did not know what he was guilty of, only that he had not been there enough in her final months. And now, sitting across from him, was a stranger wearing the necklace that should not exist outside a coffin buried in the family plot behind his estate. "I need you to understand something," Vincent said, choosing his words with great care. "I am not upset with you. You have done nothing wrong, but the necklace you are wearing was supposed to be buried with my wife 5 years ago. If it is here, in this diner, around your neck, then something happened that I do not understand, and I believe your mother may have known what that something was." Elena's hand rose again to the pendant, gripping it now as though afraid he might try to take it from her. "Are you saying my mother stole this? My mother wasn't a thief. She raised me and my brother and sister on almost nothing. She never took anything that wasn't hers in her whole life." "I don't think she stole it," Vincent said gently. "I think someone gave it to her. And I think that someone had a reason for wanting it far away from anyone who might recognize it." The diner around them had slowly returned to its normal rhythm, other customers losing interest once it became clear no violence was going to erupt at the booth by the window. But the tension between Vincent and Elena had not eased at all. If anything, it had deepened, settling into something quieter and more serious than the initial shock of recognition. "I have brothers and sisters depending on me," Elena said, her voice trembling now, not from fear of Vincent, but from the sudden weight of a memory she had never properly examined. "After our mother died, I had to take care of them. I work 2 jobs. I don't have time to unravel some mystery about a necklace." "I understand," Vincent said, "but I think this mystery may already be part of your life, whether you have time for it or not. Your mother told you to keep this necklace hidden. She was afraid of something. I would like to help you find out what that was, and in doing so, I may finally understand what really happened to my wife." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the danger of involving herself further against the ache of unanswered questions she had carried since her mother's sudden death. She thought of her mother's face in those final weeks, distracted and distant, and the strange warning she had given about the necklace. She thought of the doctors who could never quite explain why a woman in her 40s, with no history of heart trouble, would suddenly collapse and never wake up again. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked. "Only your memories," Vincent said. "Everything your mother told you, everything you can remember about the families she worked for, any name at all, no matter how small it seems. I have resources most people do not have access to. If there is a truth buried here, I intend to find it, and I would like your help doing so." Elena glanced down at the pendant resting against her collarbone, the same stone Vincent had watched sparkle against his wife's skin on countless evenings, and felt for the first time that the object she had worn every day for 2 years, believing it was nothing more than a memory of her mother, might actually be a key to something far larger than either of them understood. "All right," she said quietly, "I'll help you. But I need to know the truth too, about my mother, about why she really died." Vincent nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had grabbed her wrist, something like calm passed over his face, though it was the calm of a man who had just stepped onto a path he knew would not be easy to walk. "Then we start today," he said. "Whatever this leads to, we will find it together." He asked for her address and her phone number, promising to be in touch within a day or two, once he had a clearer sense of where to begin looking. Elena hesitated before giving them, still uncertain whether she was making a wise decision or simply allowing herself to be pulled into a world far more dangerous than the one she already knew. But something about the sincerity in his voice, the raw grief he had not bothered to hide from her, convinced her that whatever came next, he was not someone who intended to harm her. When her shift finally ended that evening, Elena walked the 6 blocks back to her apartment with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, though the evening air was mild. Charlotte and Oliver were waiting for her at the kitchen table when she arrived, homework spread across the surface between them, the small television in the corner playing quietly to itself. "You're late," Charlotte said, glancing up. "Everything okay? You look pale." Elena forced a small smile, not yet ready to explain the strange, unsettling encounter that had unfolded that afternoon. "Just a long shift," she said. "A difficult customer." She helped Oliver finish a math worksheet, made a simple dinner of rice and vegetables, and once both her siblings had gone to bed, she sat alone at the kitchen table, turning the necklace over in her fingers, studying the pendant as though it might finally reveal its secrets if she looked closely enough. She thought of her mother's tired face in those final months, the distant look in her eyes, the quiet warning she had given about keeping the necklace hidden. For 2 years, Elena had assumed her mother's caution was simply about theft, about the practical danger of wearing something valuable in a neighborhood where valuables did not last long. Now she wondered if the danger her mother had feared was something else entirely, something far larger and more frightening than a simple robbery. Across the city, in the quiet study of his estate, Vincent poured himself a drink he did not touch, staring instead at the photograph of Isabella that had sat on his desk for 5 years, her warm smile fixed forever, in a moment of happiness he had not appreciated fully enough while she was alive to give it. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he trusted completely, a private investigator named Gregory Talbot, who had handled delicate matters for him in the past without ever asking unnecessary questions. "I need you to find everything you can about a woman named Maria Whitfield," Vincent said quietly into the phone. A caregiver. She passed away roughly 2 years ago. I want to know who she worked for, when, and anything unusual about the final months of her life. Anything specific I should be looking for? Gregory asked. Vincent glanced once more at the photograph on his desk, at the necklace that no longer rested there but around the neck of a stranger who had just become tangled, unknowingly, in a mystery, 5 years in the making. Everything, Vincent said. I want to know everything. He ended the call and sat in silence for a long while, the house around him quiet, in the way it always was after dark, though tonight the silence felt different, charged with the possibility that the peace he had made with his grief over the past 5 years had been built on a foundation far shakier than he ever imagined. Outside the diner, the afternoon light had begun to shift, throwing long shadows across the parking lot, and neither of them noticed a black car parked across the street, its driver watching the diner window with quiet, careful attention, before pulling away just as the two of them rose from the booth. 3 days later, Elena stood in front of a house she had only ever seen in photographs, a sprawling stone estate surrounded by tall iron gates and manicured hedges that seemed to stretch on forever. She had grown up in a small apartment above a laundromat, sharing one bathroom with her mother, her younger sister Charlotte, and her younger brother Oliver. Nothing in her life had prepared her for the sight of Vincent Marchetti's home, and she found herself gripping the strap of her bag tightly as a guard at the gate checked her name against a list and waved her through. Vincent met her at the front steps himself, which surprised her. She had expected servants, assistants, perhaps even more guards, but he stood there alone, dressed simply in a dark sweater, looking less like the fearsome figure from the diner and more like a tired man carrying something heavy on his shoulders. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading her inside. "I know this cannot be easy for you." The inside of the house was quiet, almost too quiet, as though the building itself had absorbed years of grief and learned to hold its breath. Elena followed him down a long hallway lined with photographs, and she slowed when she noticed one in particular. A woman with dark hair and a warm smile, standing in a garden, the same sapphire necklace visible at her throat. "That's Isabella," Vincent said, noticing where her eyes had gone. "My wife." Elena studied the photograph for a long moment. There was something achingly ordinary about it. A woman simply enjoying a sunny afternoon, unaware that her life would end far too soon, and that the necklace around her neck would somehow end up traveling across the city to a stranger's collarbone years later. "She looks kind," Elena said softly. "She was," Vincent said, his voice tightening. "Come, I want to show you something." He led her into a study lined with bookshelves, where a folder sat waiting on a large wooden desk. Inside were documents Vincent's private investigator, a careful and discreet man named Gregory Talbot, had compiled over the past 3 days. Vincent had contacted Gregory the same evening he met Elena, giving him only one task: find everything possible about a woman named Maria Whitfield, who had once worked as a private caregiver in the city. "Sit down," Vincent said, gesturing to a chair across from the desk. Elena obeyed, watching nervously as he opened the folder. "Your mother worked for several families over the years," Vincent said, flipping through pages. "Most of it is exactly what you would expect. References, employment records, nothing unusual, but there is a gap, a period of about 14 months where there is no record of who employed her at all, no pay records, no references, nothing." Elena leaned forward, frowning. "When was that?" Vincent turned the folder toward her, pointing to a highlighted section. 5 years ago. The same 14 months during which my wife's health began to decline, and during which she eventually passed away." The room felt colder suddenly, though nothing about the temperature had changed. Elena stared at the dates, feeling something shift inside her chest, an old memory stirring that she had never thought to examine closely. "I remember that time," she said slowly. "My mother started coming home late almost every night. She used to leave early in the morning before I woke up for school, and some nights she wouldn't get back until after I was already asleep. When I asked her about it, she said she had taken a special job, something private, and that it paid very well, but she couldn't talk about the details." "Did she ever describe where she was working?" Vincent asked. Elena shook her head. "Only once. She mentioned a house with a garden full of white roses. I remember because I loved the way she described it, how peaceful it sounded. She said the woman she cared for loved sitting outside among the flowers, even when she wasn't feeling well. Vincent's hands tightened on the edge of the desk. Isabella had planted white roses in the garden herself, years before she became ill. It had been her favorite corner of the estate, the place she retreated to whenever the pressures of being married to a man like Vincent became too heavy to carry inside the house. "That was our garden," he said quietly. "Your mother was describing our garden." Elena's breath caught. The pieces that had felt distant and abstract just moments ago now settled into something horribly concrete. Her mother had worked in this house. Her mother had cared for the woman in the photograph down the hallway. And her mother had never told anyone, not even her own daughter, the full truth of what she had witnessed during those 14 months. "Why would she hide it?" Elena asked. "If she really worked here, why wouldn't she just tell me? Why keep it a secret, even from me?" Vincent closed the folder slowly, his jaw tight. "I think your mother saw something she wasn't supposed to see. I think whoever hired her privately, off the books, wanted to make certain there was no paper trail connecting her to this house. And I think that same person eventually paid her, or frightened her, or both, into staying silent for the rest of her life." "You think someone threatened her," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's possible," Vincent said, "and I think whoever did it is the same person responsible for my wife's death." The words hung heavily between them. Elena had come into this house believing she was simply helping a grieving man solve a small mystery about an old necklace. She had not expected to discover that her own mother's final working years, and quite possibly her sudden death, were tied to secrets buried inside these very walls. "Who had access to your household during that time?" Elena asked, trying to steady her voice, trying to think clearly despite the fear rising inside her. Vincent exhaled slowly. "Many people. My staff, my associates, my closest advisors. At the time, I trusted every one of them completely. I was consumed with business matters, expanding certain operations, dealing with disputes among rival families in the city. I left the daily management of the household, including Isabella's care, to the people closest to me." "Do you have a list of who was working here then?" Elena asked. "Gregory is compiling one now," Vincent said. "But there is someone I need to speak with directly, a man named Nicholas Bennett. He has been my closest advisor for nearly 20 years. He managed the household staff during Isabella's illness. If your mother was hired quietly, without records, it is very likely he was the one who arranged it." Elena studied Vincent's face carefully, noticing the way his expression tightened at the mention of this man's name, a mixture of loyalty and unease that seemed to war with each other behind his eyes. "You don't want it to be him," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Vincent looked up at her, surprised by her perception, though he supposed a woman who had spent years serving impatient customers in a diner had likely learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Nicholas has been by my side since before Isabella and I were married," he said. "He was there when I built everything I have. He was there when I buried her. If he had any part in what happened, it would mean 20 years of trust were built on something rotten underneath." "But you still want to know," Elena said. "I have to know," Vincent said, "whatever the cost." That evening, Vincent arranged a quiet dinner at the estate, inviting Nicholas under the pretense of discussing a minor business matter. Elena remained hidden in a side room adjoining the dining area, watching through a narrow gap in the door, her heart pounding as she studied the man who entered. Nicholas Bennett was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being trusted without question. He greeted Vincent warmly, clasping his hand, laughing easily at some small joke about the weather, entirely unaware that his every movement was being observed with new suspicion. "You look tired, old friend," Nicholas said, settling into his chair. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about the past," Vincent said, watching him carefully. "I've been going through some old records, household staff, mostly, from around the time Isabella was ill." Something flickered across Nicholas's face, so brief that Elena might have missed it entirely had she not been watching so intently. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a smooth, practiced calm. That was a difficult time for all of us, Nicholas said carefully. Why bring it up now? I found a gap in the records, Vincent said. A caregiver who worked here for over a year, with no official documentation. Do you remember anything about that? Nicholas's hand paused briefly over his wineglass before continuing the motion, lifting it to his lips, as though nothing unusual had been said at all. It was a long time ago, Vincent. I handled dozens of hires during that period. You had me managing the entire household so you could focus on business. I can't recall every name. Her name was Maria, Vincent said, his eyes never leaving his old friend's face. Maria Whitfield. The glass in Nicholas's hand trembled, just slightly, just enough for Elena to notice from her hiding place, though he set it down quickly and forced a small, uneasy laugh. I really don't remember the details, he said. Why does this matter so much now, after all these years? Vincent leaned forward, his voice dropping low and steady. Because that woman's daughter is wearing Isabella's necklace, the one I buried with her, and I intend to find out exactly how that happened, no matter how long it takes, or whose comfortable arrangement it disturbs. The color drained slowly from Nicholas's face, and in that single moment, watching from behind the door, Elena understood with terrible clarity that whatever secret her mother had carried to her grave, this man sitting across from Vincent Marchetti knew exactly what it was. Nicholas left the estate that night visibly shaken, offering only a hurried excuse about needing to attend to a family matter across town, and Vincent let him go without pressing further. He understood, better than most, that cornering a man too quickly could cause him to run rather than confess. Patience, in his line of work, had always been more useful than force. He knows something, Elena said, stepping out from the side room once the front door had closed behind Nicholas. Did you see his hands? He could barely hold his glass. I saw, Vincent said quietly, 20 years, and I have never once seen Nicholas Bennett's hands shake. Gregory Talbot arrived at the estate early the next morning, carrying a leather satchel filled with additional documents he had gathered overnight. He was a small, precise man, with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory, the kind of investigator who noticed details others overlooked entirely. I found something interesting, Gregory said, spreading a set of papers across the study desk. Financial records from 5 years ago. A series of payments made from a private account, not connected to any of your official businesses, Mr. Marchetti. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger ones, all directed to an account under the name Maria Whitfield. Elena leaned over the desk, studying the numbers with growing unease. How much money are we talking about? Over the course of about a year, nearly $200,000, Gregory said, paid in installments, the kind of payments someone makes when they want to keep a person quiet, without drawing attention through one large, suspicious transfer. Vincent's jaw tightened as he studied the account details. Whose signature authorized these payments? Gregory flipped to another page, pointing to a scanned signature at the bottom of a transfer form. Nicholas Bennett's. The room fell silent for a long moment. Elena thought of her mother's cramped apartment, the years spent scraping together rent money, working double shifts, quietly worrying about how to afford new shoes for her children before winter. If her mother had truly received that much money, where had it gone? Certainly not into their small, struggling household. That doesn't make sense, Elena said slowly. We never had that kind of money. We were barely getting by most months. If my mother was paid that much, I never saw any of it. Gregory nodded, having anticipated this question. I looked into that as well. Most of the money appears to have moved through her account very quickly, transferred elsewhere within days of each deposit. It looks less like payment for services and more like money passing through her account on its way somewhere else. She was being used, Vincent said grimly, as a conduit. Someone needed a way to move money without it being traced back to them directly, and your mother's account became the pathway. Elena felt sick. Her mother, exhausted and desperate, working long hours to provide a modest life for her children, had unknowingly become part of some larger financial scheme, one significant enough that whoever orchestrated it needed complete secrecy. There's something else, Gregory said, pulling out a final document. Medical records. I managed to obtain copies of the prescriptions filled during Mrs. Marchetti's final year, through channels I would rather not describe in detail. There are several medications listed here that don't match any diagnosis her doctors documented at the time. Vincent took the papers with trembling hands, scanning the unfamiliar names of medications, chemical compounds he did not recognize, dosages that seemed inconsistent with any illness he had been told his wife suffered from. "What are these?" he asked. "I had a pharmacist I trust review them," Gregory said carefully. "Individually, in small amounts, most of these medications are harmless, sometimes even beneficial. But combined, over an extended period, they can cause symptoms very similar to heart failure, fatigue, irregular heartbeat, sudden collapse. The kind of symptoms that would be very difficult to distinguish from a natural cardiac event, especially if the examining doctor wasn't looking for anything unusual." Vincent set the papers down slowly, his hands flat against the desk as though he needed something solid to keep himself upright. 5 years of believing his wife's death had been a tragic accident of nature, an illness that struck without warning and could not have been prevented. 5 years of guilt over not recognizing the signs sooner, of wondering if a different doctor, a different treatment, might have saved her. "Someone poisoned her," he said, his voice barely audible, slowly, over months, and made it look like her heart simply gave out. Elena watched him carefully, seeing the exact moment grief transformed into something colder, something more focused. She thought of her own mother, dead suddenly of heart failure, at an age far too young for such a thing to happen naturally, and felt an old, unexamined suspicion rising sharply to the surface. "My mother died the same way," she said quietly. "Sudden heart failure, no warning. The doctors said it was unusual for someone her age, but they didn't investigate further. There was no reason to suspect anything." Gregory looked between the two of them, understanding dawning slowly on his face. "You think the same method was used on both women?" "I think," Vincent said slowly, "that someone silenced my wife because she discovered something she wasn't meant to see, and then silenced Maria Whitfield 2 years later because she knew too much about how it happened." The weight of that realization settled over the room, like a physical thing. Elena's mother had not simply died of natural causes after years of quiet, honest work. She had likely been murdered, just as Isabella had been, both women connected by a secret that someone had been willing to kill to protect, not once, but twice. "Why would she keep working for you at all, if she knew something so dangerous?" Elena asked. "Why not just leave, take the money, and disappear somewhere far away?" "Perhaps she tried," Vincent said. "Or perhaps she was frightened into silence, rather than simply paid for cooperation. Fear is often a stronger leash than money." Gregory cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the desk. "There's one more thing. I traced the account where most of the money from Maria Whitfield's transfers eventually landed. It took some effort, since several shell accounts were used to obscure the trail, but eventually, all roads led to the same place." "Where?" Vincent asked. "An account controlled by Nicholas Bennett," Gregory said. "Under a name that isn't his own, but everything else about the account, the login patterns, the linked properties, all of it traces back to him." Vincent closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect the previous evening, watching his oldest friend's hands tremble around a wine glass. "Why would he do this?" Elena asked. "What could possibly be worth killing your wife over?" Gregory hesitated before answering, glancing at Vincent as though seeking permission to continue. Vincent gave a small, tired nod. "I looked into your business holdings from that period as well, Mr. Marchetti," Gregory said. "There were significant discrepancies in several accounts Nicholas managed directly on your behalf. Money that should have been reinvested into legitimate business fronts instead disappeared into personal accounts over the course of several years. If Mrs. Marchetti discovered these discrepancies and threatened to expose them to you, it would have given Nicholas a very powerful reason to want her silenced before she could speak." Elena thought of the photograph in the hallway, the warm smile of a woman who had no idea her life was already being measured out, in careful, deliberate doses, by someone she likely trusted completely. "She found out he was stealing from you," Elena said slowly, piecing it together. "And instead of confronting him directly, or maybe after confronting him and being reassured everything would be fixed, she became a liability he couldn't afford to keep alive. And my mother," Elena continued, her voice growing tighter, was hired to care for her during those final months. She must have seen something, heard something. Maybe she even suspected what was happening, but didn't understand the full picture until it was too late to matter. Vincent stood from his chair and walked slowly to the window overlooking the garden, the same white roses Maria had once described to her young daughter years before either of their lives had become entangled in this way. He stared out at them for a long moment, his shoulders rigid with a fury he had not allowed himself to feel in years, a fury that had been buried beneath grief for so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly angry rather than simply sad. "I need to speak with Nicholas again," he said finally. "But this time, I won't be gentle about it." "Be careful," Gregory warned. "If he's capable of what we suspect, he may not respond well to being cornered directly. Men like that often become dangerous when they realize they have nothing left to lose." "I've known him for 20 years, Vincent said quietly. "I think I understand exactly how dangerous he can become." Elena watched him carefully, noticing the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides, the careful, controlled breathing of a man forcing himself to remain calm despite everything inside him wanting to unravel entirely. "What happens now?" she asked. Vincent turned back to face her, his expression settling into something hard and resolute, the look of a man who had spent his entire life making difficult decisions and was not about to let this one be any different. "Now," he said, "we find out exactly how deep this goes, and then we make certain he never has the chance to hurt anyone else again." Before that could happen, Elena insisted on returning home to check on Charlotte and Oliver, unwilling to let the weight of the day's discoveries pull her away from the two people who depended on her most. Vincent offered to have a driver take her, and though she hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the idea of arriving home in a car far too expensive for her modest street, she eventually accepted, too exhausted to argue. During the short ride, she stared out the window at the city passing by, turning over everything she had learned. Her mother had spent an entire year working inside a house she never once mentioned by name, caring for a woman whose photograph now felt disturbingly familiar, receiving payments that never reached their small apartment, carrying a fear she had never fully explained. Elena thought of all the nights she had assumed her mother was simply tired from long hours, when in truth, she may have been carrying the unbearable weight of knowing far too much about people who could not afford to let her speak. When she arrived home, Charlotte was waiting up, worry etched across her young face. "Where have you been? You said you'd only be gone a few hours." Elena sat her sister down at the kitchen table, weighing carefully how much to share. She decided, for now, to tell her only a partial truth, enough to explain her frequent absences, without frightening her with details still too uncertain to fully explain. "I'm helping someone with a family matter," she said. "It's connected to Mom somehow. I don't understand all of it yet, but I think I might finally learn why she was so distant those last few months." Charlotte's eyes widened. "Do you think someone hurt her?" Elena hesitated, unwilling to lie outright to her sister, but equally unwilling to burden a 15-year-old with suspicions she herself did not yet fully understand. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I intend to find out, whatever it takes." The following morning, Vincent called a meeting with Gregory once more, reviewing every remaining detail of the financial records before deciding how best to approach Nicholas again. He wanted no room left for denial, no gap through which his old friend might slip away from the truth a second time. "I want everything documented before we speak with him again," Vincent said. "Every transfer, every signature, every discrepancy. If he tries to talk his way around this the way he did before, I want to be able to place the evidence directly in front of him, undeniable." Gregory nodded, already organizing the papers into careful, methodical order. "There's one more account I haven't fully traced yet," he said. "It may take another day or two, but I believe it will confirm exactly how the money moved from Maria Whitfield's account into Nicholas's control." "Take the time you need," Vincent said. "I would rather have the full truth than a rushed confrontation built on half of it." 2 days later, with every remaining piece of evidence finally assembled, Vincent sent word for Nicholas to return to the estate. Nicholas Bennett did not come easily. When Vincent sent word asking him to return to the estate the following evening, Nicholas answered with a series of excuses, first claiming illness, then a sudden business emergency across town, then silence altogether, refusing to answer his phone at all. It took 2 days, and the quiet involvement of men Vincent trusted completely, before Nicholas finally arrived at the estate, escorted rather than invited, his usual composure entirely gone. He stood in the same study where Vincent had reviewed Gregory's documents days earlier, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as though physically restraining himself from shaking. "Vincent, whatever you think happened," he began, "I can explain everything." "Then explain it," Vincent said, standing behind his desk, his voice dangerously calm. Elena sat quietly in the corner of the room, close enough to hear everything, far enough to remain out of the immediate line of tension stretching between the two old friends. Nicholas glanced at her, clearly uncomfortable with her presence, but Vincent made no move to send her away, and Nicholas seemed to understand that arguing the point would only make him appear more guilty. "The money," Nicholas said slowly, "the discrepancies in the accounts. I want you to understand, Vincent, it started small. A little extra here and there, nothing that would ever be noticed, nothing that would hurt the business. I told myself I deserved it, after everything I had built alongside you, all the risks I had taken on your behalf over the years." "And Isabella found out," Vincent said. It wasn't a question. Nicholas's shoulders sagged, the last of his composure crumbling entirely. "She found records. I don't know how. She was clever, Vincent. Cleverer than either of us ever gave her credit for. She confronted me directly, told me she intended to tell you everything unless I returned the money and stepped away from managing the accounts. So you killed her instead," Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper, though the words carried more force than any shout could have. "I never meant for it to go that far," Nicholas said, his voice cracking. "I only meant to buy time, to find a way to make things right before she said anything to you. I hired a caregiver, someone with medical knowledge, someone who could quietly manage certain adjustments to her treatment without raising suspicion. I told myself it was only meant to weaken her resolve, to make her too tired and unwell to follow through with her threats. I never intended for her to die. You poisoned my wife," Vincent said, slowly, over months, in her own home, while I was too consumed with business to notice what was happening right in front of me. "I loved you like a brother, Vincent," Nicholas said desperately. "Everything I built beside you. I never wanted this. It spiraled beyond anything I intended, and by the time I realized how far things had gone, it was already too late to undo any of it." Elena watched from her corner of the room, feeling sick at the casual way this man spoke of a woman's death, as though it were simply an unfortunate accident of circumstance rather than a deliberate, calculated choice made to protect his own comfort and reputation. "And my mother," Elena said, unable to remain silent any longer. "Maria Whitfield, the caregiver you hired. What happened to her?" Nicholas turned to look at her fully for the first time, something like genuine regret passing briefly across his features, before hardening again into careful self-preservation. She didn't know the full truth at first. "I told her only that Mrs. Marchetti needed certain medications to manage stress and anxiety, nothing that would raise alarm. But she was intelligent too, and eventually, she began asking questions I couldn't answer without revealing too much." "So you paid her to stay quiet," Vincent said. "I paid her generously," Nicholas said, "more than enough to secure her family's comfort for years. I gave her the necklace as well, told her it was simply a gift, a token of gratitude for her discretion during a difficult time. I never expected her to keep it, let alone pass it down to her own daughter." "You gave her the necklace off my wife's body before it was buried," Vincent said, his voice rising for the first time. "You desecrated her before I even had the chance to say goodbye properly, and you did it to buy silence from the woman who helped kill her." "I didn't think anyone would ever connect it back," Nicholas said weakly. "It was foolish of me. I understand that now. But at the time, it seemed like a small gesture, a way to ensure her cooperation without drawing suspicion through a larger, more traceable payment. And when Maria's silence became inconvenient," Vincent said, "when perhaps she began to feel guilt over what she had done, when perhaps she considered coming forward with the truth, you had her silenced permanently as well." Nicholas's face went pale, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, which was answer enough for everyone in the room. She contacted me about a year before she died, he finally admitted. She said she couldn't live with what she had helped do. She said she wanted to tell someone the truth, to finally set things right, even if it meant facing consequences herself. I convinced her to wait, told her I was working on a way to make amends properly, to protect her children from any fallout. I promised her everything would be handled carefully. And then I made certain she never had the chance to change her mind. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Elena felt tears sliding down her face before she even realized she was crying. Grief and anger tangled together so tightly she could barely distinguish one from the other. Her mother had spent her final year carrying the unbearable weight of a secret that was slowly killing her from the inside, wanting desperately to do the right thing, only to be silenced permanently by the very man who had trapped her into complicity in the first place. "You took everything from both of us," Elena said, her voice shaking with fury. "You took Isabella's life, and my mother's life, and you let me grow up believing she simply had a weak heart, that her death was just a cruel accident of nature. You let me carry that necklace around my neck for 2 years, wearing a piece of the woman you murdered, without ever once feeling the need to make it right." Nicholas had no answer for her, his silence confirming everything she had already understood to be true. Vincent stood very still behind his desk, his hands pressed flat against the wood, his breathing controlled but ragged beneath the surface. 20 years of friendship, of shared history, of trust built brick by brick over decades, had just crumbled entirely in the span of a single conversation. The man standing before him was not the friend he had known, but a stranger, wearing a familiar face, someone who had allowed greed and fear to justify the destruction of 2 innocent lives. "You will answer for what you've done," Vincent said quietly. "Not through violence, not through the old ways I once might have chosen without hesitation. I have spent 5 years believing I had lost my wife to fate, to something beyond anyone's control. I refuse to let her memory be tangled any further in bloodshed carried out in her name. You will answer for this properly, through evidence, through consequence, in a manner that ensures the full truth is known by everyone who ever trusted you." Nicholas looked up sharply, clearly having expected a very different response from a man of Vincent's reputation. "Vincent, please, think about what exposing this would mean, not just for me, but for you, for the business, for everything we've built together over the years." "I have thought about nothing else for 5 years," Vincent said. "I have carried guilt I never deserved, believing I failed my wife by not being present enough during her final months. I will not carry the burden of protecting her true killer, for even one more day, out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to the past." He turned to Gregory, who had been standing quietly near the door throughout the entire exchange, documenting everything with careful, practiced discretion. "Ensure every piece of evidence we've gathered reaches the proper authorities. The financial records, the medical documentation, everything. I want this handled through channels that will hold, ones that cannot be quietly buried or explained away." Gregory nodded, already moving to secure Nicholas, who offered no resistance, his shoulders slumped with the exhausted defeat of a man who understood there was no longer any escape from the consequences of choices made years earlier. As Nicholas was led from the room, he glanced back once at Vincent, his expression a strange mixture of regret and disbelief, as though even now he could not quite accept that the empire of trust he had built alongside his oldest friend had finally, irreversibly, come crashing down around him. Elena remained seated in her corner of the room long after Nicholas had been taken away, tears still drying on her cheeks, the necklace at her throat feeling suddenly much heavier than it ever had before. "Thank you," Vincent said quietly, moving to sit across from her, "for your courage. For helping me uncover a truth I might never have found without you." "I didn't do it for courage," Elena said softly. "I did it because I needed to know what really happened to my mother. I needed to understand why she spent her final year so afraid, so distant, carrying something she could never tell me." "And now you know," Vincent said. "Now I know," Elena repeated, though the words brought little comfort, only the quiet, heavy weight of truth finally settling into place after years of unanswered questions. Later that night, after Gregory had left with Nicholas and the estate had settled into an uneasy quiet, Vincent walked Elena to the car waiting to take her home. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, both still absorbing the weight of everything that had unfolded inside the study that evening. "I keep thinking about how ordinary that day felt," Elena finally said, standing beside the open car door. "I was just serving coffee. It was a normal shift, like any other, and then suddenly, nothing about my life was ordinary again." "Grief has a way of doing that," Vincent said. "One moment everything feels settled, predictable, and the next, the ground disappears entirely beneath you." "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "Finding out the truth, I mean, even knowing it meant losing someone you trusted for 20 years. Vincent considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that it happened at all. I regret every year I spent believing a lie, grieving something I thought I understood. But I do not regret knowing the truth, even now. A painful truth is still better than a comfortable lie, especially one that costs other people their lives." Elena nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant, having spent 2 years unknowingly wearing a piece of that very same lie around her own neck. "Get some rest," Vincent said gently, as she finally climbed into the car. "There will be more to sort through in the coming days, statements, questions from investigators, decisions about how much of this becomes public. But for tonight, you've done enough. You've helped uncover more truth in a few short weeks than I managed to find in 5 long years." Elena offered a tired, grateful smile as the car pulled away from the estate, leaving Vincent standing alone beneath the tall stone archway of his home, staring up at a sky full of stars he had not properly noticed in longer than he could remember. The weeks that followed moved quickly, though to Elena they often felt suspended in a strange, unfamiliar stillness, as though the entire world had shifted slightly on its axis, and she was still learning to walk steadily on the new ground beneath her feet. The evidence Gregory had gathered was handed over carefully, methodically, to people Vincent trusted, to ensure the truth would not simply disappear into quiet arrangements and forgotten paperwork. Nicholas Bennett's 20 years of carefully built reputation unraveled swiftly once the financial records and medical documentation came to light. The full scope of his deception and the tragic consequences of his greed laid bare for anyone willing to look closely. Vincent did not attend every step of the proceedings that followed. There were parts of the process he could not bring himself to witness directly, moments where the full weight of Isabella's final months threatened to overwhelm him entirely. But he made certain, every single day, that the truth continued moving forward, that nothing was quietly buried, the way so many uncomfortable truths in his world often were. Elena returned to her small apartment above the laundromat each night, back to her siblings, back to the life she had built out of necessity after her mother's death. Charlotte, only 15, had grown remarkably steady during Elena's frequent absences over those weeks, taking on more responsibility around the apartment than any teenager should have needed to carry. Oliver, just 11, asked constant questions about where Elena kept disappearing to, questions she answered as gently and honestly as she could manage without frightening him with the full, complicated truth. One evening, nearly a month after Nicholas's confession, Vincent arrived at Elena's apartment unannounced, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, without the usual entourage of guards trailing behind him. Charlotte answered the door, wide-eyed at the sight of him, before quickly fetching her older sister. "I wanted to see how you were doing," Vincent said, standing awkwardly in the narrow hallway outside their apartment. "It occurred to me I hadn't asked, not properly, not since everything settled." Elena studied him for a moment, noticing the tired lines around his eyes, the way grief had settled into him differently now, less sharp and consuming, more like a permanent, quiet ache he had learned to carry alongside everything else. "We're managing," she said. "Better than before, actually. Knowing the truth, even a painful truth, is easier to carry than not knowing at all." Vincent nodded slowly, understanding that sentiment more deeply than most people ever could. "I've set up an account," he said carefully, "for you and your siblings, not as payment and not as charity. Consider it long overdue compensation for what your mother endured, for the silence she was forced to carry to protect her family, for a debt that should have been paid to her years ago and now falls to you instead." Elena started to protest, old pride rising instinctively at the offer, but Vincent raised a hand gently, stopping her before she could refuse. "Please," he said, "let me do this, not out of pity, but out of respect, for what your mother sacrificed, whether she fully understood the danger she was in or not. She deserved better than what she received. This won't undo what happened, but it will ensure her children never have to struggle the way she did." After a long moment, Elena nodded, understanding that this was not merely generosity, but a genuine attempt at repairing something broken, a small piece of justice extended toward a family that had suffered enormous, unseen loss. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For believing me that day in the diner, instead of assuming I had stolen something or lied about where it came from. I could see the truth in your face immediately," Vincent said. "You were as confused and frightened as I was that afternoon. I think some part of me recognized that we were both carrying grief we didn't fully understand yet." A comfortable silence settled between them for a moment, the kind that only forms between people who have shared something difficult and emerged from it changed, though not broken. "Will you visit her grave?" Elena asked. "Isabella's, I mean, now that you know the truth." "I visit every month," Vincent said. "I have for 5 years, but I think this time will feel different." The following weekend, Vincent stood alone beneath a wide oak tree in the quiet cemetery behind his family's estate. Isabella's headstone simple and elegant, exactly as she would have wanted it. In his palm rested the sapphire necklace, finally returned to him after weeks of careful legal processing, the small stone catching the soft afternoon light, exactly as it had years earlier around his wife's neck. "I know now," he said quietly, speaking to the stone as he had done countless times before, though this time his words carried a different weight, less confusion, more resolution. "I know what happened to you. I know why. And I made certain the person responsible will never hurt anyone else again." He knelt slowly, placing the necklace gently against the base of the headstone, letting it rest there among a small cluster of white roses he had planted years earlier in her memory. "I'm sorry it took me this long," he continued. "I'm sorry I trusted the wrong people, while you were suffering right in front of me, but I found the truth, Isabella. Even if it took 5 years, even if it cost me a friendship I once thought was unbreakable, I found it, and I made sure it mattered." The wind moved gently through the oak leaves above him, and for the first time in 5 years, Vincent felt something loosen in his chest. A weight he had carried so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Elena visited her own mother's grave that same weekend, a much simpler plot in a smaller, quieter cemetery across the city, marked only with a modest stone bearing her mother's name and the years of her short life. Elena knelt beside it, placing a small bouquet of flowers gently against the grass. "I understand now," she said softly, "why you were so scared, why you told me to keep the necklace hidden. You were trying to protect us, even while you were trapped in something you couldn't escape. I'm not angry with you anymore, not for any of it. I just wish you had trusted me enough to tell me the truth, so we could have faced it together, instead of you carrying it alone." She stayed there for a long while, watching the afternoon light shift slowly across the cemetery grounds, feeling a strange, unexpected peace settle over her, the kind that comes only after truth finally replaces uncertainty, however painful that truth might be. In the months that followed, Elena used part of the money Vincent provided to move her family into a larger, safer apartment, one with enough space for Charlotte and Oliver to each have their own room for the first time in their lives. She continued working at the diner, though fewer hours now, choosing instead to enroll in evening classes she had long postponed, working steadily toward a nursing degree, drawn perhaps by an unspoken desire to help others the way her mother once had, but without the secrecy and danger that had ultimately cost her mother everything. Vincent, for his part, restructured much of his business in the months that followed Nicholas's downfall, working carefully alongside new, more carefully vetted advisors to ensure nothing similar could ever happen again without his knowledge. He visited Elena and her siblings occasionally, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine, growing fondness for the family that had unknowingly helped him find peace after 5 years of unanswered grief. On a quiet afternoon nearly a year after that first encounter in the diner, Vincent returned once more, this time simply to share coffee with Elena during a slow afternoon shift, the same diner, the same booth by the window where everything had first unraveled. "It's strange," Elena said. pouring 2 cups of coffee and sliding into the seat across from him, exactly as she had that very first day. If you hadn't noticed the necklace, none of this would have happened. My mother's death would still be an unexplained mystery, and Isabella's murder would have gone unpunished forever. Sometimes, Vincent said, wrapping his hands around the warm cup, the smallest details carry the heaviest truths. I'm grateful every day that I happened to walk into this particular diner, on this particular afternoon, and that you happened to be the one serving my table. Elena smiled softly, glancing down at her bare collarbone, the necklace now resting safely beside Isabella's grave where it belonged, finally free of secrets, finally free of danger. So am I, she said quietly. So am I. Outside the diner window, the afternoon sun continued its slow descent across the city skyline, casting warm, golden light across 2 people who had found unlikely connection through unimaginable loss, both of them finally, after years of unanswered questions, able to breathe a little easier, knowing that even the deepest, most carefully hidden truths eventually find their way into the light.